Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ITO Masterclass. Today is we're going to be looking at maximizing learner engagement with strategic lesson plans. So I want to welcome everyone to this presentation. I want to introduce myself before we get started. So I'm a Suraasa education specialist. I'm the lead teacher trainer here at Suraasa. I'm also part of the school improvement team. And I'm the manager of what we call the Boosting Employability Program, where I help, where I train and work with teachers and best prepare them for interviews and for the job market as a whole. I've been in education for over 20 years. I'm from the United States, so I started off my career teaching in the US domestically, and then I switched to international teaching. I have taught both as a university literature instructor. I taught Shakespeare, poetry, drama, film, writing, and composition. And then I was a high school teacher, and I taught AP Language, IB Language and Literature, and the Common Core curriculum. I lived and worked internationally for over 12 years. I worked in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I worked in Korea, lived in Seoul. I lived in Guangzhou, China, taught there. And I also taught in the UAE. And so it's a pleasure to kind of meet everyone on YouTube. And we're going to go ahead and get started. I do want to say at the outset that this session is going to be a little bit long. There's a lot of information, okay? And so if you want to ask questions, type your questions in at the end. It would be helpful if you kind of reference the part of the presentation that you have a question about. And later on, I have a table of contents that you can reference if you have any questions, okay? And so the first thing I want to do in order to get started is just a quick icebreaker. I know there's a lot of people on the call, but I would like to kind of see some responses to this. And so my question to you all is the following. Based on your previous experience in the classroom, what are the main ways that you have attempted to engage your students in learning? What are the main techniques that you have used? So why don't you go ahead and just kind of put your responses in the chat. I will monitor them and see what kind of pops up. And I have been told that there's kind of a 6-second delay between what I see and what I say and what you hear. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the chat right now and see what people are coming up with. What are the main techniques that you have used? And if you're not in the classroom, just think in hypotheticals. So go ahead and do that now. Okay. Gamification, cooperative learning, brainstorming, role-playing, activities, play method, flipped classroom, peer teaching. Okay, so there's a lot here. And even just looking through this chat, what I'm rapidly realizing is you guys know a lot, and you're already mentioning things that I will be talking about in this presentation. I saw differentiation, quizzes. A lot of people like flipped classroom. That's great. I will say something about that later. So thank you for responding. We're going to go ahead and move along. Here are the objectives for today. After attending this masterclass, learners will be able to differentiate between positivism and constructivism in their lesson plans, to define essential questions to engage student learning in their lesson plans, to explain differentiation in order to engage students in lesson plans, to identify various teaching methods and strategies to engage students in their lesson plans, and to implement total participation techniques, what is often referred to as TPT. Okay? So those are the learning objectives. They're pretty modest. And the takeaways, How does a constructivist pedagogy provide the foundation of an interactive and engaging classroom? Why are organizing centers for your lesson plans an effective way to engage learners in a unit? How do essential questions in your lesson plans engage and inspire learners? Which teaching methods and strategies in your lesson plans are the best for engaging learners? And then finally, how do differentiation and assessment work together in your lesson plans in order to engage learners? So this is all about engagement, and you're going to hear me repeat that word over and over and over. You're going to be sick of hearing it, but I'm going to continue to say it. Okay? So engagement. How do we engage students? That's what we want to talk about. And there's a myriad of ways. And in this presentation, I'm starting from the macro and moving down to the micro. Okay? So here's the table of contents. And so ideally, if you want to gauge your learners, these are the things that you're going to want to focus on. And this is in the order in which I'm presenting them in this masterclass. Your lesson plan should be grounded in a constructivist pedagogy, and I will explain what that is if you don't already know. Your lesson plan should connect to organizing centers as a part of the curriculum. I'm guessing that this one might be the one that's going to be new to people. Your lesson plan should include essential questions that drive the unit. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about essential questions and their purpose in a lesson plan and in a unit overall. Your lesson plan should utilize interactive teaching methods and strategies. You should employ engaging activities and develop differentiated activities. I saw a lot of people that put that in the chat. They are way ahead of me. Okay? And then finally, your lesson plan should contain authentic assessments, either formative or summative. Okay? So I would encourage people to take a screenshot of this, because if you have any questions at the end, this might be the thing that you want to refer to. Like I said, there's a lot of information in this presentation. And so what I would encourage people to do is, if they ever feel like they need to take a screenshot of a slide, go for it. Some of the things that I'll be talking about, I'm going to be talking about relatively briefly. I would encourage you to do additional research, look up any of these terms, look up any of these activities if you are not aware of what they are. All the information is out there. Okay? So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is constructivism. Okay? And I think it's really important to start in this place, not to be pedantic. That's not the reason, but it sort of guides everything that comes afterwards. Okay, this is the orientation that we want to have in our classrooms. And some of you may already be doing it without even necessarily knowing what the term is. Okay, so constructivism is an epistemology, which is a theory of how one comes to knowledge. Okay, so this is the definition. So I'll put that up there for you. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that seeks to define knowledge, that seeks to explain what it means to know something, that seeks to understand how students come to know things. What we mean by knowing is an essential question. Epistemology provides an answer to that question, and so provides an essential philosophical foundation for educational practice. Now, I know that that's very wordy and academic, but the point is for our purposes, there are kind of two competing strands of epistemology: how students come to knowledge in a classroom. Okay? And so these are the two: positivism and constructivism. I'm going to tackle the right first. Feel free to kind of wander around the slide on your own. But basically, positivism is that sort of traditional teaching. Now, I don't know how old everybody is on the call, but this would be something that probably I would have experienced when I was in high school. And so if you ever see kind of a movie or a black and white photograph of like schools in like the 50s or 60s or 70s, this is probably going to be what you see, is positivism, that traditional teaching method. And so under this epistemology, knowledge is factual and verifiable information waiting for us to find it. Okay, so the knowledge is out there. We need to find the knowledge. To know is to be familiar with facts discovered by experts. So in other words, in the traditional way of teaching, there are experts and they give us the knowledge that we need based on their expertise. So if you've ever heard the term coverage, and I've used the term as well in my lessons, we got 2 weeks left. We haven't covered everything that we're meant to cover in this unit. So when you do that, coverage means knowledge is a thing. It's something to be acquired rather than what I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is a process. Okay. So positivism is basically a banking model. Students are passive and they await for the knowledge to be deposited. The teacher is the most important figure in the classroom. They are the center of attention. And what they are the experts in their field, and they give the knowledge, they deposit the knowledge to the students. Presumably then, the students are all the same, and they're all blank slates, and they are there to receive the wisdom of the person standing in the front of the room. Okay? Constructivism, however, is the exact opposite in every conceivable way. So meaning is assigned to facts rather than the facts themselves. So facts are meaningless unless they are interpreted by a human being. So knowledge is the process of when we assign meaning to the facts that we learn. When we make sense of factual information, that is when we come to knowledge. Knowledge is constructed by human beings, and this construction needs to be cultivated in the classroom. We need to construct that. We need to give students the opportunity to construct their own knowledge. We set it up, we facilitate it, but they need to construct their knowledge based on who they are and their past experiences. So real knowledge is that learners are going to be able to do something with the information in the classroom rather than merely regurgitating it or repeating it. So the learner is the most important person in the classroom. And you'll notice on this slide, I kind of highlighted students and learners. There's a lot of people talking about it these days, this sort of semantic transition from student to learner, whereas student seems to represent being passive, using the word learner instead of student. It gives more agency, it gives more activity, it gives more autonomy to the person in the classroom. That learning is a process. Okay, so that's a small detail, but I do think it's important to understand in the way we think about the people in our classroom. That if we think about them as students, that's very traditional. They're there, we give them information, they're passive, we tell them what to do. Whereas a learner, they are learning a process. They are engaged in the process of learning. Okay? And I think that that's a really important point. So if you look at this slide, there's a couple of interesting things on here. Again, we construct our knowledge in our minds through our interaction with the environment. Okay? We build on prior knowledge. like a notice the simile, like a builder constructing a skyscraper. So we always want to activate that in our students, get them to access and activate their previous knowledge, their experience, whenever they're learning something new in our classrooms. So we learn through experiences, we learn through social interactions. Okay, learning occurs in stages, and we should be active, giving them opportunities to be active rather than passive. And this third bullet point here, social interactions. I feel like that's the most important, okay? That we as educators, we're facilitating educational experiences for students to learn from each other in the classroom. That's the constructivist model, and that's the way students are going to be more engaged in their learning. They're not going to be engaged listening to you talk. And I love to talk, but that's not the way that they learn. You got to pass off, hand the baton to them and get them to talk to each other. That's the way that they're going to learn. So a constructivist classroom is student-centered, student-empowered. It's democratic, which is a word you don't often hear, especially in a traditional classroom. The teacher's the boss, right? It's interactive. The teacher as a researcher and facilitator. We negotiate with our students, and learning is a process. And so personal experience and background are crucial under this epistemological model. Learner interest and personal investment are crucial. So a constructivist classroom is going to be loud, okay? Students are speaking, they're listening, they're writing, they're interacting, they're collaborating. I want them to argue too. Okay, they're working on projects, right? Should be a loud, interactive environment. And teachers, our job is to orchestrate these experiences for them. I'll say more about this later, a constructivist classroom, authentic assessments rather than objective tests, filling in the bubble or selecting A, B, C, or D. I want to move away from that. So the students receive all this disparate information, and it needs to be congealed and personally constructed into a meaningful whole by the student based on who they are, their individual experience, and their individual backgrounds. So this type of classroom engages student interest and curiosity. Therefore, they're going to be more engaged. This is also a classroom where there's lots of self-assessment. Students are able to assess themselves and their learning and reflect on the process. I don't know if I mention it anywhere else in this presentation, but let me just highlight this now, that in most classes, maybe not all, but most, you should be building in opportunities for students to reflect on their learning, okay? That should be built into the lesson plan. So it's interactive overall. So that's constructivism. So we start wide and we're getting a little bit more narrow. So now we're talking about curriculum, long-term planning, medium-term planning. So organizing centers. So you don't have to put it in the chat. We'll do an activity later. But in your mind, I'm going to give you two sets or two examples, A and B. And I'm going to let you read it. I don't need to read it for you. I'm going to let you read it. And in your mind, I want you to think about, if you were a student, which unit you would rather study. Let's look at set number one. Look at those two. Grapes of Wrath, students read a novel, study the Great Depression, write a book report. Look at the second one. Look at the title. Literature or Life. In this unit, students study the essential question, what is more real, literature or life? They read several poems, short stories, and a novel to analyze the time period in which the work takes place. So in this case, it might be the Grapes of Wrath during the Great Depression. Learners use their understanding of that connection to write their own review of a contemporary novel and how it reflects the values and lifestyles of today. Wow. So I don't know about you, but if I was a student, I'd rather do B, for sure, because it looks like I have some choice. I can bring in my experiences, my interests, okay, my understanding. I can choose my own novel and how it reflects the values in society the way I see it. And even this question, I'm going to talk about essential questions later. What is more real, literature or life? Think about all the interesting responses you might get from your students. Now, again, this is an example kind of from what I teach. And so I apologize that some of the examples are going to be, English teacher centric, maybe American centric. So I apologize, but you can certainly, this is applicable to any discipline, any content knowledge. Okay. So literature or life, I bet some students say that life is more real. I bet some students might say, well, actually literature might be in fact more real. So this sounds like where learning takes place. This sounds constructivist. This one, A, sounds very old-fashioned. Sounds like someone with a lot of knowledge about this novel and the Great Depression is going to give you a bunch of information to write in your notes. Sounds boring. This sounds much more interesting. Now, that doesn't mean you won't learn any of this stuff, but it's not the focus of the unit. Let's take a look at the next one. Go ahead and read that on your own. Goods and services, students learn the difference between businesses. They learn about which businesses sell goods and which ones do services. But look at letter B, the business of business. What do you do? They explore different types of businesses by analyzing those in their community, where they live. They conduct individual additional research and will interview a local business person and will write a business proposal. B sounds constructivist. They're tapping their previous knowledge, their background, their individuality, their experience. They're focusing on their local community. They're picking the person that they want to interview as inspiration, and they write their own business proposal, not someone else's, their own. So if I was a student in both of these examples, I would choose letter B, absolutely. So now I'm going to give you the definition of what an organizing center is, now that you've seen a couple of examples. An organizing center is the central idea upon which a unit of study is built, right? We're not studying the Grapes of Wrath. We're studying literature or life. That's the difference, right? It is communicated through the title, essential question, and big idea. Quality organizing centers are built around themes, concepts, issues, problems, processes, phenomena. So this is something to think about when you're doing your units. You're not just teaching math. What are the themes? What are the concepts? What are the issues? What are the problems that those math questions are supposed to solve? I'm not a math teacher, so I apologize. I don't do math ever. A quality curriculum will organize the units of study around centers that are, notice what I italicized here, worthy of the time and energy set aside for their pursuit and reflect the overall intent and purpose of the curriculum. So you want to engage your students in learning? You should have an organizing center that demonstrates that whatever they're learning is worthy of their time. And if you can convince them that this is worthy of the energy that they're going to put into it, you're going to have a great class. Students are going to be engaged, and they're probably going to learn a lot. So worthy of the time and energy, can you make that case to the learners in your classroom? By the unit and the title that you create for them. So let's do an activity right now. And I want you to put it in the chat. I will pause to kind of see how many people respond. And I'll kind of tell you to stop so the A or B doesn't bleed into the next series of questions. But which organizing center do you think is more engaging based on what we've just discussed? If you were a student, which would you rather do? So let's look at the first example. What about these two? Put A or B in the chat right now. Now, I know this is not very hard. I don't think I'm going to stump many people. But everyone gets it. Animal structure, survival. What does it take to survive? Wow, that sounds so much more interesting. You can bring in so many other things into that unit. That doesn't mean you're not going to still talk about animal structure, but you're going to situate it within the larger rubric of survival. That can engage learners in your classroom. What about these two? A or B? I'm looking at the chat. I can't tell if people are still answering the first one or this one. But yes, B is an organizing center. It's much more interesting. Regions of the United States, how are regions unique? Does where you live matter? Of course it does. And think about, by just posing that question, already students are thinking about, or learners are thinking about, where they live. Does that matter given my experience? My experience of the world, being from the United States, being from the Midwest, being from Chicago, is going to be different from someone that may have grown up somewhere else, even within the United States. Sorry to be United States centric. My experience might be different than some guy that grows up in LA. I have a different view of the world. That stuff matters. A or B, what do you think? A or B? This one's tricking some people. I switched it. A is the organizing center. what really happens, talking about natural phenomenon versus how has the Earth's surface changed over time, right? And then finally, look at the last two, A or B. I'm going to move a little quicker here, just looking at the time. If I was a student, this fourth pairing, which would I choose? Again, America's economy. How does the economy work? It sounds like a bunch of stuff I got to memorize. What does it take to be innovative? That sounds like something that even if I might not know how the economy works, I can certainly come up using my background, using my experiences, I can make some sort of educated guesses on what innovation might be. So you see how this works. So in all of these instances, A, B, A, in that sequence, those sound like topics. Those are not organizing centers. Now, is it possible that like a student can go, wow, the American economy, how does the economy work? That sounds interesting. I can't wait to learn about it. Doesn't mean no one's interested. But organizing centers are better for engaging students because you're dealing with themes, concepts, problems, and essential questions, which you're going to learn about next. Okay? So in other words, organizing centers, if they're properly constructed, they move away from merely topics to bigger ideas, concepts, or essential questions. I'm not teaching Macbeth in my 10th grade English class. I am teaching the concept or the essential question of, does power corrupt those who possess it? That's what I'm teaching. And I use Macbeth as the means by which to teach that. There is a big difference. They can be explored from different perspectives across content, place, or time. So you can make connections, right? Those organizing centers that I used earlier, what was I'm not going to go back to the slide, but the one about, does where you live matter, right? So in other words, I could have a class and in that class, I could have people from the United States. I can have people from India. I could have people from Indonesia. I could have people from the UAE, and they could all equally answer that question, no matter what their background. So it can be explored from a number of different ways, right? I could bring in extra material from the past, historical material, right? You could do anything. Is relevant and meaningful because it results in the application of something bigger than school, okay? Which I think is really important. This information and these skills is useful beyond these four walls. It's bigger than school. School is when you learn about the Great Depression. But it's more meaningful when you start thinking about what is more meaningful or more real, life or literature. Requires higher levels of thinking in order to analyze, evaluate, and create. And obviously, as I've said a million times, it directly engages learner interest. Okay, you can create that and cultivate that for your students. And you can also teach them how to be interested in something, right? You can model that and show them that. So organizing centers. So now we're getting a little bit more specific. Again, we're starting wide and moving inward, going from the macro to the micro. Essential questions. I don't know if you've ever heard this term before. Comes from a book. I've cited it at the bottom of the slide, Understanding by Design. Highly recommend people get that book. That is kind of the gold standard of education these days. At least it has been for the last, 15 years, 10 years. They're important and timeless. They're foundational for a discipline. And they're what is vital for understanding. So with your colleagues in your departments, you should be thinking about what are the questions that are foundational for math? What are the foundational questions that all historians ask themselves? What scientists ask themselves? What athletes and coaches ask themselves, right? And they're timeless. What is more real? Literature or life? That's a foundational question for any person interested in literature to grapple with. It's timeless. Okay. So the characteristics of essential questions, they're open-ended. There's not a single answer, right? If you ask your students, what's more real, literature or life? There's going to be a zillion different responses, right? They're open-ended. They're intellectually engaging and challenging. They reflect the big ideas. I love number 4. They raise additional questions. Answers are so boring. Additional questions are what's really interesting. But when you do get good answers, they require support. Okay, you said it, now justify it, back it up, explain your reasoning. And you can revisit them over and over and over again. I used to do this. If I'm doing a thematic unit in an English class, I might pose the essential question, get students to respond, do it in the middle of the unit, always going back to it. And then at the end of the unit, I'll pose it again. And presumably they're going to have a better understanding and a more nuanced response than they did at the beginning, because presumably there's been a bunch of learning in between and knowledge acquisition in between. Okay? So here are some examples. Imagine you're a high school kid or a middle school kid. What's worth fighting for? Wow, that sounds like an interesting unit. How do you answer that? I don't know. A zillion different ways. To what extent is history a history of progress? Does art reflect culture, or does art shape culture? What an interesting question to ask your students if you're in a history class or art history class or sociology class or English class or whatever, any type of humanities class. Are mathematical ideas inventions or discoveries? I don't know. I'm not a math person. That's an interesting question. And I bet people in the math field have struggled with this. What do we fear? Is biology destiny? To what extent must a story have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Is that true? Do we need that? How can foreign cultures be described without using stereotypes? To what extent can they be described without resorting to stereotypes? So these are all examples of essential questions from a variety of disciplines, okay? And so we use these essential questions to highlight that thoughtful inquiry should be the prominent goal of education. Want to build that into the student's personality. Want them to become curious about that. It's more engaging, helps clarify and prioritize standards, transparency for students, higher order thinking, metacognition, become activated when we use essential questions, allows learners to transfer their knowledge to different contexts, and provides opportunities for intra and interdisciplinary connections within other units that you've studied and across different subject matters, okay? It supports meaningful differentiation. So guiding questions and unit questions versus essential questions. I'm going to show you what these look like. And presumably, I'm guessing, and again, you'll forgive some of the examples. I know that they can be very narrow. But think about what you're doing right now in your classroom. If you're a science teacher, a math teacher, music teacher, gym teacher, right? Look at this. What is the moral of this novel? Essential here. Look at this. And then look at these on the right-hand side. What is the moral of this novel we're reading? Must a story have morals? In the story of Arnold Lobel, are the frog and the toad true friends? What about this? Who is a friend? How about asking your students that? Building a unit around that. Who is a friend? What is friendship? What does that mean? Why do we crave it? Those are the questions that are going to get your students interested. How do cats see in the dark? What is light? Okay? You get the idea. So this goes back, it's kind of reminiscent of some of the organizing centers earlier, because some of those organizing centers are built around essential questions. So there is some overlap. And so I'm guessing most people, I know my classes, when I first started teaching, they look like the ones on the left, for sure. And then when I learned, and it's hard work. I worked at a school once where we spent an entire semester as a high school. Every department was doing it, and I was doing it in the English department. We spent the entire semester crafting essential questions for our units, writing them out and workshopping them and peer reviewing them. It's a long process. It doesn't just happen overnight. So let's do another activity. So I'm going to put a question, and I want you to write in the chat. I wouldn't write guiding or essential. Maybe put put G or E instead. Maybe just put G or E. Okay. I'm seeing people in the chat write A, B, A, B. I don't know what they're doing. So here's the first one. Is this a guiding question or an essential question based on what we've discussed so far? What makes a story last? Is that guiding or essential? Write it in the chat. I'll pause to see how many people respond. People are all over the place on this one. Interesting. And that's okay. That's okay. And hopefully you'll see the difference when I cycle through a few more. That's an essential question. There's no way to answer that. There's a myriad of ways to answer that. Why does a story last? Why do stories maintain their grip on us, tens or hundreds of years later? Right? What about this one? What is erosion? Is that essential or guiding question? I will pause. That is a guiding question, because you can give an answer to that. What is erosion? I'm sure someone who knows about it could explain it. I'm going to go a little faster. How might you describe the characters in this story? See what people put. There's so many people that I can never tell if they're answering this question or the previous question. That is a guiding question. You're just asking, you're reading a book. How do you describe the characters? Doesn't sound essential. That's not getting to the heart of a discipline. Are all leaders great? Are all leaders great? Wow. I don't even know how to answer that question. That's essential. Guiding. I'm going to move a little quicker here. Is beauty in the eyes of the beholder? That's essential. So take a look at the screen. Maybe take a screenshot of it and really get a sense of the difference between essential and guiding, right? Essential is beauty in the eyes of the beholder. Are all leaders great? What makes a story last? These are timeless questions. These are open-ended questions. They get to the foundation of different disciplines, okay? These are ways that you could build a unit around, right? You can't build a unit around what is erosion, but you can sure build a unit around, are all leaders great? That sounds like a great unit in a history class or a political science class, okay? So in other words, essential questions are more engaging for your students and allow them to construct meaning based on their own experiences. How I answer, are all leaders great, is going to come from my experience. Even if I don't know anything about the period in history class being studied, I can certainly reflect on being alive. Who are the leaders that I'm aware of? What are the different types of leaders? Are we talking about political leaders? Are we talking about leaders local leaders in a community? Are we talking about like leaders on a sports team, right? Whatever. Okay. So you can bring your previous knowledge into answering these questions. I can't bring my previous knowledge to erosion because I don't know what it means, possibly, right? You see the difference. That's the point. If you want to learn more about essential questions, go to the Suraasa website, go to the masterclasses, and you can see two masterclasses that I gave on this particular topic. They're each about 45 minutes long if you want to learn more and go into more detail. Okay? So now we're going to move on to teaching methods and strategies. Now we're moving a little bit more narrow. A lot of you put this in the chat earlier. Here's one way: collaborative learning. Groups of students working together to solve problems, complete tasks, or create a product. I'm sure most people do this to a certain degree. Some do it more successfully than others, right? Again, this needs to be cultivated. It's not just put students in a group and tell them to do something and then put your feet up on the desk and do something else, right? This needs to be facilitated. Collaborative learning, problem-based learning. Again, each of these would fall under a constructivist classroom, right? Students learn about a subject by solving some sort of problem, given some sort of trigger material, whatever material you're using as the problem, right? I suppose you could learn about, if you're in a science class, you could learn something about science, or maybe learn something about some scientific concept if you pose the problem as like global warming or something like that, right? A flipped classroom. A lot of people put this in the chat already, so it seems like a lot of people know about this already. But basically, you flip the order. A traditional classroom, you do the teaching, and then you send the students home to do all the work of what they learned, solve all those math problems. But they don't have anyone to help them. You don't know who's with them. You don't know who's doing the work. You don't know if they're copying. You don't know if their parents are doing it for them. If they need help, they might not be able to get help. But in a flipped classroom, they go home. They watch a lecture by you. They watch a couple of carefully curated videos that you've given them, maybe an outline of something. Their homework is to just watch and consume that stuff. And then they walk into your math classroom or their science classroom, and now they start working. They start doing the thing that they learned about. So you flip the normal experience, the traditional experience of teaching. I'm going to teach you things. Now you go home and do it on your own. Okay? You flip it. Okay? And so now, if the kid is stuck on his math problem, the teacher can help him, or his classmates can help them. And you can actually see them doing the problems and know if their work is authentic or not. This is one I'm sure a lot of people might not be familiar with. 6 thinking hats strategy for learning, for engaging students. Basically, it's just a strategy for dealing with an issue or a problem or a concept by metaphorically putting on different hats. That's an expression. If you put on a different hat, you're looking at something from a different perspective. So imagine you're doing a unit. Again, I'll just use the same example about, like, I don't know, like you're an earth science class and you're learning about climate change and global warming, and you're having students discuss it, or, and you design an activity where some students are dealing with the facts and information about global warming and they're posing questions. Some students are dealing with the feelings and anxieties associated with global warming. What are the difficulties and potential problems that we're going to face as a society as a result of global warming? Hard to think of any upsides, but, are there any benefits or any values that we can learn from this experience? How do we manage the process? What are the creative solutions to, I don't know, rising sea levels, right? Or rising temperatures. I don't know the solutions, but get your students to think about it. So in order to think about what this might look like, I'm just going to use a meta example. My God, I'm almost at an hour. I'm not even close to being done. I hope you all are patient. 6 thinking hats analysis using the 6 thinking hats. So how do we understand this teaching strategy? By thinking about it as a strategy. So look at this. If you're wearing the white hat, data, you might ask yourself, what age groups of students can be involved in this activity? How many students can be involved at what time? What subjects can I use this for? That's it. Those are interesting questions to ask based on what you teach. I know that as an English teacher, I know I could do this in class. Right? I don't know about other disciplines. Maybe gym class, it might be hard. Maybe math class, it might be hard. I'm not really sure. That's up to the math teacher to decide. But this is something that's really interesting, like what age group? Like, I think this is appropriate for older students. I don't think this is going to be good with like 3rd graders. I doubt it. But I'll leave that up to you. How many students? Well, I don't know. I think this works better in a big class rather than a small class. I think if I had 25 students in a classroom, this would work great. I once taught an IB class where I only had 5 students. I taught two sections, and each class had 5 students. I would not use this teaching strategy if I had a class of 5 students. Why? Because I don't even have enough students to reach 6. Okay? It wouldn't work, right? So I'm using the 6 thinking hats to think about how this could potentially work in my classroom. What are the feelings associated with this? How does a teacher feel while planning the strategy? How might students feel doing this class, right? Difficulties. I'll put on the black hat. When should we not be using this strategy? What are the obstacles that we need to overcome if we're going to use this strategy in our classroom? I'm going to put on the yellow hat. What are the benefits of using this strategy in the classroom? How does this get managed? How do all the moving parts fall into place? Who does what when? Who says what when? What order do things take place? Who says what? That all needs to be figured out. And what are the solutions to the potential problems that arise? Right? So you could use this strategy to think about how the strategy may work in your classroom. Now, when I look at a strategy like this, I'm thinking there's got to be group work of some sort. You might put students into homogeneous groups and then maybe put them in heterogeneous groups, something like that. I'm making it up. There's no way to know how to use this. You can use it however you want, whatever makes sense to you. Wherever you feel that there is something in your class, a problem or an issue or a theme or a concept that can be looked at from different perspectives. If there's a moment where that happens, you might be able to craft or create an activity around this. So in other words, traditional teaching falls on the top part of this pyramid. Lecturing, reading, having students watch things, teacher doing a demonstration. I'm not saying you should never use this stuff. By all means, like I love using videos in class and having students watch videos. I love it. I think it's great. But they're only going to retain 20%, right? But if you have a constructivist classroom that's student-centered, where learners are always in a process of learning, they're doing discussions, they're practicing, they're teaching others to do things, right? That's where real learning happens. That's where true learner engagement happens, at the base of that pyramid. So all of these teaching strategies help do this. So take a screenshot of this if you feel. I'm not going to go over this, but just know that you have your teaching strategies on the left-hand side. That's open-ended. That's longer. There's a vision in place. If you're doing cooperative learning, that might take place over an entire unit, a series of units. Whereas teaching methods, they're shorter, they're fixed, they have an order, right? If you're doing a think, pair, share, there's only one way to do a think, pair, share. You think, you pair up, and then you share your ideas, right? And you could use that as many times as you want, okay? So I want to do a poll right now, just to get you back engaged. And so I'm really curious about this. And I'm sure everybody on the call would be curious about what other people say to this answer. And so you're going to see a poll at some point. I don't know who puts it up or where it's going to appear on your screen. But this is the question I want to ask you. Which of these teaching strategies do you mostly use in your classroom to engage learners? What you're already doing. These are the 4 choices. You can only choose one. I don't know if you're going to do this in the chat or if you're going to see the poll, but these are the 4 choices. What are you relying on already? What do you do the most? Even if you do all of these, what is the teaching strategy that you rely on right now? Refer to your screen for the question and the answer. And so instead of doing it in the chat, the poll, I can see it popped up. Why don't you go ahead and post right there? I already see there's 70 votes. I still see people doing it in the chat. It's not going to register. If you do it in the chat, you want to do the poll. I don't know when we'll see the results of the poll. But I'm sure somebody somewhere in cyberspace will release the results of this poll. Okay, interesting. All right. So out of 210 votes, about 50% rely on A. And that's exactly where I thought it would be. Right? Whereas flipped classroom, even though people knew about it, it's probably the one done the least. And so you should think about maybe, expanding your horizons in some way. I know that as an English teacher, I never really used a flipped classroom. Just wasn't conducive to what I was doing. I probably should have, in hindsight, maybe I should have been more creative and tried to incorporate it in some way, but really none of my colleagues did either. This was something we kind of eschewed, okay? I was going to do another poll. You know what? Let's do another poll. We can do it. We have time. We're already at an hour. We do have 2 hours. Hopefully, I will not be talking for 2 hours, but there's another poll. Which of these teaching methods do you mostly use in your classroom? Think, pair, share, student teaching, debates, role play. What do you typically use already? What do you rely on more than anything? So let's see if that poll pops up. You could try answering this one. I'd be really curious. And I'm sure others are curious as well. You got to choose one. Don't give me A, B, C in the chat. No, doesn't do any good. I use them all. Thank you. You're a genius. I don't know if the poll is going to pop up. Yes, someone wrote in the chat, where is the poll? I'm asking myself the same question. I don't think it's popping up, so we're going to go ahead and move on. So, engaging activities. So think about what we've done. Constructivism, organizing centers, essential questions, strategies and methods, activities, getting narrower. I want to talk about something called total participation techniques. TPT is how it's often called. Okay. This is something that's developed. You can see the names of the people that developed this technique in the citation on the bottom of the screen. So there's a lot to total participation techniques. The first part about it is something called the ripple. Some of you may do this already, but I can tell you that a lot of teachers don't. I'm part of the school support team, so I often visit classrooms. And when teachers are posing questions to students, it's usually rapid fire. It's usually lower order thinking. The same students answer. They're either yes or no questions. They're closed-ended. They're not very interesting. But if you're using the ripple, as you look on your screen, all students are respond individually to a higher order prompt. So this isn't just a quick discussion. You're posing a prompt. Maybe it's an essential question. Could be. Everybody gets an opportunity to respond to the prompt in writing. And I'm here to tell you that even if you're a math teacher or science teacher, students should be writing in all of their classes, no matter what. Not just English class. They should be writing in every class. Students respond. Give them a couple minutes, 2, 3, 4 minutes. They pair up or in small groups, almost like a think, pair, share, but it doesn't have to be exactly. They share the information, they have a discussion, and then selected students and volunteers share information on behalf of the group for the larger classroom discussion. So you're maximizing, even though everyone's not talking necessarily, Students are still all engaged. They're all doing something. Every student is engaged in the process. Why? Because every one of them has been writing. Every one of them has talked to each other. Now, there may be only a few volunteers, students that want to share, or the teacher picks a couple students on behalf of each group to generate that larger discussion, but everybody is involved, okay? So that's the ripple. I remember once, and I remember learning this. It wasn't exactly the TPT framework, but I remember I was struggling with a class and I had a teacher come in and watch me. I wanted to get some outside perspective. And with this group of kids, they weren't very open. I couldn't really generate a really good discussion. And he was like, well, give them more time, right? Have them write, have them talk about it with each other first before you have the classroom discussion. Have them test their ideas and get comfortable with them in smaller units. That's a form of practice before they then build the confidence to share it in front of everyone. That's a ripple technique, okay? As part of the total participation techniques, the TPT. The TPT also has something called the cognitive engagement model. So notice how this works. Low cognition, low participation. Low cognition, high participation. High cognition, low participation. High cognition, high participation. And so in any lesson plan, if you go through everything that you do from beginning to end, every discrete, disparate activity is going to fall into one of these categories. Doesn't mean you should avoid them, but it means the majority should be 3 and 4. The high cognition. Okay? So let me show you what this looks like. Low cognition, low participation. This quadrant's usually at the beginning of the unit, might be introductory material, background, vocabulary. So the students are not going to be doing much. They're going to be listening, right? It's pretty easy. You can imagine you're doing a unit on, I don't know, the French Revolution in history class. And you're going to want to what's the time period? What are the dates of of when what happened? Who are the major kind of historical figures, right? That's that kind of background information, right? Whenever I do a Shakespeare unit, I always give a big background about Shakespeare, who he was. What are the plays? What's the difference between a tragedy and a comedy and a history play, right? So that's LL, low and low. Then you got your low cognition and your high participation. So maybe it's an introductory activity at the beginning of the unit. It's something that might get them excited. Might be some sort of activity or project. It's kind of superficial, but you get everybody involved. I'll give you an example of how I did this once. Again, my Shakespeare unit. At the beginning of my unit, we looked at the beginning of Macbeth and the opening scene where the witches are on the stage. And to get them excited, I had them start thinking about the supernatural. And it's okay. If you were a stage director, how would you stage this opening scene with the witches? How do you do it? Make a poster and draw the characters on the poster of how they would be represented on the stage. And wow, the kids had a great time doing that. Now, this is low cognition, but it's fun. It gets them excited. There's an interpretive and analytical quality to it. And they made some really fun, interesting posters that we then put all over the wall. Then you get your quadrant 3, high cognition, low participation, right? So maybe these are group projects where one person is presenting on behalf of the group. Maybe these are Socratic seminars that even though it's high cognition, everybody kind of speaks at the time. And maybe during a Socratic seminar, you might only talk once or twice. You have to be active listener. Okay. And so maybe if I'm doing a really kind of rigorous discussion with the students over a passage and it's pretty difficult, maybe I'm only going to get a couple of participants because it's high cognition. Not every student's going to be able to answer and do it on the fly during our discussion. So there might be low participation. And then the last part, quadrant 4, is the activities that you create for your students that allow them to come to a deeper understanding and everybody is involved. So in other words, the ripple questioning technique that I talked about at the beginning would fall under quadrant 4. Okay? And so the next slides are going to be all activities that are meaningful and fun that would pop up in a high cognitive, high participation section. Okay? And again, those examples are not going to be English examples. Okay? Now I'm looking at the clock. And we don't have to do this activity in the chat. You can just kind of do it in your head because I want to move a little bit quicker here. We are already in almost an hour and 15 minutes. Thank you for being patient with me. So this activity is about which quadrant, 1, 2, 3, or 4, if you were doing this in the classroom. So the teacher reads a poem that the learners are going to end up analyzing eventually. So teacher reads a poem. Quadrant 1, 2, 3, or 4. I'll pause, but I'm going to go rather quickly. You should be thinking about it. So the answer is 1. That's low participation, low cognition. You're just listening to the teacher. Now, I used an English example, but that's any example. Use your own discipline. Look at this one. Volunteers are selected to share their interpretations with the class. Presumably, this came after some sort of group discussion. So that would be 3. High cognitive, but low participation because only one person from the group is talking. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bad activity. By all means, you should absolutely be doing this in your classroom, right? So we always want to have our activities at 3 or 4, even though all numbers are going to be covered. The teacher takes a poll as to how many learners recognize the poem. Well, that's a 2, right? Because that's low cognitive, but high participation. Everybody's answering, right? Learners were asked to draw a symbol that represents a major theme in the poem, drawing a visual representation of something that you're learning. Everyone has to do it, and that sounds pretty complicated. That's going to be in quadrant 4. The teacher provides a list of poetic terms and definitions. It's 1. It's got to be done, but it's 1. The teacher asks learners to pair up and discuss a prompt related to the poem. Doesn't have to be English class. Teacher asks learners to pair up and discuss any prompt in your psychology class, your history class, your math class. But obviously, it needs to be open-ended. That's a 4. Okay, so you see how this works. So if you look at your lesson plan, you can review your lesson plan. You can look at it and say, where do each of these activities fit in these 4 quadrants? You know that all 4 are most likely going to be represented, but hopefully you're going to have more 3s and 4s than 1s and 2s, okay? That's the point. So these are some of the techniques. These are some of the quadrant 4 activities that you can do with your students. Now, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. What I would suggest is maybe taking a screenshot and you can look them up on your own. No advanced preparation. Think pair share, quick writes, quick draws. This is what I had. This is one of the things that I referenced in my previous activity. This is what I used. A visual representation to a prompt, having students writing. Again, notice that this is not English centric. This can be done in any class, okay? Mouth it. Say it out loud to yourself, whisper it to a neighbor. You can take a screenshot of this. Oh, I forgot one. Sorry. Ranking. Select items that can be ranked and analyzed and have students justify their choices. I love doing this activity. Picking 10 things and saying, okay, rank them in the order that you want and justify why. Some preparation. Number cards. Have students hold up a number card to answer a specific prompt. Show me a prime number. You got a bunch of numbers. Raise it up. True or not true. Create 4 cards. True, not true, true with some modifications, and unable to determine. And have students hold them up when responding to a question or a prompt. Presumably, this is going to be something that's difficult, high cognitive, open-ended. I'll go back if someone wants to take a screenshot. Active participation in cognitive development. Movement. This. Get students out of their seats, doing interesting things. Lineups. Get them out of their chairs. Have them line up based on their response to a prompt where they form a parallel line. They talk to a person across from them. Networking, having them do the conversations while standing up, timing it, and then having them switch partners, finding a new person to talk to. Bounce cards, having a discussion with sentence starters to keep the conversation going. Sorting activity, categorizing activity. Right? Imagine if you had a bunch of toys in the room and they have to go around and pick up all the toys and sort them into different categories. How would they do it? Right? So you could take a screenshot of this. Concept analysis. When you're wrapping up a lesson or summarizing a lesson, anticipation guides. Picture notes, 3-sentence wrap-up, A to Z summaries. This is fun. I've done this. Assign a learner a letter from the alphabet, and each learner provides a summary of the lesson or what they've learned in a sentence starting with that assigned letter. And you read the sentences out loud. Could be fun, but that's high cognitive behavior, okay? That's cognitively challenging. You could take a screenshot of this. So now we're moving on to differentiation. I told you there was a lot of content in this presentation because you want to engage your students. This is how you do it. Differentiation. Here's the definition in case you don't already know. I know there's a bunch of people on this call that know what it is. Differentiated instruction is an instructional approach that acknowledges the reality that students differ in ways that significantly affect their learning. All your students are different. That's why the banking model doesn't work. They come into your classroom different. They have different interests, different capabilities, different experiences, different talents. It contends that teaching and learning are more effective when teachers proactively plan to address student differences. And a constructivist classroom does that. Okay? Banking method doesn't work with everybody, right? Funny enough, it actually works with me. It's really easy for me to sit in a room and listen to someone who knows a lot and who's smart, tell me a bunch of things. I'm totally patient. I can sit and listen and not get bored if I find the topic interesting. It's fine, right? But a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people don't learn that way. So you have to have a class that engages all the learners with their various skills, backgrounds, and interests, and differentiation does that. This quote comes from a book by Carol Ann Tomlinson, Understanding Differentiated Instruction. She has a lot of books out. She's kind of the most famous guru of differentiation. If you don't know her, you should look her up. There's other experts in the field, but I feel like she might be the most famous. So teachers can differentiate through content, process, product, or the environment. So you can differentiate through one of these according to readiness levels, student interest, or learner profile. Okay? So in other words, you may have different content based on students' readiness levels. Some students can't read Shakespeare. They can't. So I give them the No Fear Shakespeare, right? So I would be differentiating by content. Okay? So on and so forth, right? Or maybe I have different content based on a student's learner profile, which basically means their learning style, right? Maybe I have different content based on students that want to learn visually or by reading or by something else, okay? So here are some activities for readiness levels: small groups, learning centers, learning stations, and the most common one, tiered activities. You have an activity that students are doing, that most students are doing, you augment the activity to make it a little bit more difficult for your high flyers and make it a little less difficult for the struggling students. Interest centers, jigsaw activities, anchor activities, raft assignments, orbitals. So raft assignments, role, audience, format, and topic. They're doing a writing assignment based on something that they're interested in. What's their role? Who's the audience? What's the format they're going to write in? What's the topic? Orbitals, extension of a topic based on student interest, right? So you can imagine giving students the opportunity to extend their learning in various ways given their interests in the class. And then learner profile, creative activities, having them move around standing rather than sitting, tasks based on learning styles, or stations based on learning styles. Okay, if you're a visual learner, you want to do this or learn in this particular way. Okay, so take a screenshot of this. And you can look these up on your own. So also, teachers can differentiate by product. Okay? What do you produce to show that you've learned something? Okay? So there's a number of different ways to do that. So you might give students choice in the product, right? And so if I go back, maybe it's student interest. You're giving them a choice, okay? Here's one way to do it. I've seen teachers do this, so I know the strategy's out there. Choice board, tic-tac-toe board, where you have a bunch of activities. There's one in the middle that all students have to do, and then students can choose their own pathway based on, whatever, right? And so you orchestrate this, you create a word board where maybe, the really strong students are most likely going to go from bottom left to top right. The weaker students are going to go from top left to bottom right. The visual learners may choose to go from middle left to middle right, so on and so forth. You have to orchestrate the activities to give students choices based on either interest or readiness levels, to do certain tasks to check their learning, probably in preparation for a test. You can do it the same way using a menu. You can set up a menu just like at a fine dining restaurant. You may have had like a set menu where you choose your appetizer. They give you choices. You choose one. They give you a choice of entree. You choose one. They give you a choice of dessert. You choose one, so on and so forth. The same thing can be done with different activities that you have students do in the class to show their knowledge. Maybe some of the activities are going to be really difficult. And those are for the really strong students that want to challenge themselves and can work relatively quickly. Maybe you need some super easy activities for some of the students that are struggling, so on and so forth. Okay? And so, when you differentiate by product, what you're essentially doing is doing formative and summative assessment. So, it's going to be the last thing that we talk about. This is the last thing on our agenda. So we are approaching the end. And you'll see this word, authentic. Any authentic assessment, which is usually products or performance tasks, for which teachers might have a subjective point of view and which measures multiple skills and criteria, can be objectively evaluated using a rubric. So, in a constructivist classroom, we're moving away from objective tests, multiple choice tests, true and false, fill in the blank, and moving more towards other things to show their knowledge. I mean, as an English teacher, I do a lot of essay writing in class. I don't think I've ever given a multiple choice test in one of my English classes, unless it's a quiz, like on terms or something. All my tests are essays followed by a project. So I always do 2 summative assessments at the end of a unit. Timed test, writing, high pressure, high stakes. Most of my classes throughout my career have been 80 minutes, 85 minutes. You write for 80 minutes, and then you go like this with your hand. And then after that, they work on a collaborative project, right? So these look fun. If I was a student, role playing, any type of physical exercise, if you're in like a physical education class, a lab experiment, portfolios, maybe students build a portfolio throughout the year, throughout the semester that then gets summatively assessed, projects, presentations, debates, oral recitations or interviews. I've done exams, end of unit exams, where I sit with each person individually and I ask them questions and they respond verbally to me one-on-one, and I record it, and then I assess their answers later with a rubric. So if you're using a rubric, what does that mean? That means that you are measuring many different skills simultaneously. If a student is doing a presentation like a PPT and they have 7 minutes and every student has to do it, or 5 minutes, there's a number of different skills that you would measure using a rubric, right? You can't just have them do their presentation and then say, okay, 92, right? That doesn't make any sense. You have to have what are the skills? Maybe time management, maybe clarity of voice, maybe smooth transitions, maybe the accuracy of the content, maybe the design of the slides. Maybe you give them some parameters, right? So you use a rubric. And so on authentic assessment, you apply knowledge to real-world situations. They're relevant and meaningful to learners. They require higher order thinking. These are transfer skills. If you could do a presentation in my class, You can do something similar in other contexts. Authentic audience. Whenever students used to do presentations, I used to invite parents in, administrators in, teachers from other classes, and other students to come in and watch them. So it's an authentic audience, right? Learners are engaged. It taps their diversity, and this is constructivist and differentiated. So I'm always transparent about the criteria by which they are assessed. Okay? I share the learning destination with the students at the beginning. If I'm using a rubric that's already created, I share it at the beginning of the unit and say, this is how I will assess you. This is the project at the end. Here are the things that you're going to need to learn. And I often share examples of student work, past students. Here's what a bad one looks like. Here's what a good one looks like, right? It wouldn't be the exact same content, but I would show them. And oftentimes you can create this stuff with your students, right? You can have brainstorm activities where you say, okay, you have to give a PowerPoint at the end of this unit. What do you think are the criteria by which you should be assessed if you're giving a presentation? And I guarantee you the hands are going to go up and some kid's going to go, how clearly I speak. And you're going to go, yep. And then you write it down on the board. You build it together, right? That gets buy-in and student engagement because they have helped create the criteria by which they will be assessed. Here's an example. Young students, they have to do a book report. These are the categories. It needs to be interesting, easy to follow, and easy to read. And then you ask students to kind of fill in, okay, what makes something interesting to an audience? And they come up with the criteria, right? Same with any rubric, right? Whether it's an analytical rubric, a holistic rubric, or a single point rubric, you can help build this with your students and use it for formative assessment. I mostly use analytical rubrics. I use them for both formative and summative assessment. And all my units or all my lessons in the unit are giving the students different skills that will be required of them when they finally do the summative assessment. So you can build this with your students or have students use these for self-assessment and reflection as you're moving through a unit. Okay, we're done. We're at the end here. After attending this masterclass, hopefully you will be able to, I'm not going to read all of these because my voice is tired. Hopefully you will be able to do all of these things after attending this masterclass. And hopefully you will be able to answer these questions at the end of having attended this masterclass. Hopefully you can know how to do essential questions. Why are organizing centers important? How does a constructivist pedagogy provide the foundation? I ended with this. How do differentiation and assessment work together? Hopefully you can answer those questions, okay? So here's my works cited page. I gave a particular shout out to Carol Ann Tomlinson and Wiggins and McTighe. All teachers should know those texts. So I urge you to join Suraasa teacher community. You can continue the discussion in the chat, the ITO community chat. You can scan the QR code to join the community and continue the conversation around how to engage students in your lesson plans, not only at the micro level, different activities and strategies, but at the macro level, thinking about how you can create a student-centered constructivist classroom where you give students the opportunity to bring and build off of their previous knowledge and previous experience. And remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel. So, I know there's a zillion people on this call. And so if you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and type it in the chat, and I'll see if I can quickly sift through it and find one that I might be able to answer. Well, everyone's very nice. Some nice comments in the chat on me. Thank you. I want to thank you for sticking with me. I'm sure there's people that bobbed in and out. 90 minutes is a long time to hear me drone on and on, but I hope it was useful. And so I am going to pause to see if there are any questions in the chat that I can answer or attempt to answer or pivot and answer something else. So I'm going to pause and just kind of look. Please have a glass of water. Yes, I will. I will indeed have a glass of water. Okay, I'm looking at a question here. I'm trying to keep it from moving up. Someone wrote rubrics are more useful for formative assessment more than summative assessment. I think they're both useful. I mean, rubrics are useful because they can accurately measure products or performance tasks that students produce to show their learning. And those performance tasks are going to be complex. And so that's how students are really going to demonstrate their knowledge. I think if you have students build something or present something, you're going to learn a lot more about them than if they fill in circle A, B, C, or D on a multiple choice test. Right? But in order to be effective on the summative, they need to be doing lots of formative work. So part of that formative work that they're doing during the unit will be skills related to the final activity. So rubrics are good for both formative and summative. Now, some rubrics are better for summative, like a holistic rubric, and some rubrics are better for formative, like a single point rubric, and some can do both, like an analytic rubric. Okay? So I hope that answers your question. And you'll forgive me for pausing. I'm just trying to sift through here. With all the comments, it's hard to find the question. Someone asked, can you suggest other analyzing strategies other than 6 thinking hats? Not off the top of my head, I can't. Typically, I just make stuff up on my own. Like, it doesn't have to be something that, like 6 thinking hats is, it's almost like a product. It's almost like, it's a thing that you do. But, I make up analysis activities all the time that don't attach to some sort of teaching method or strategy, right? I just make it up. I don't know anything about how to deal with a hyperactive child. I don't teach smaller kids. I'm a high school teacher and college instructor. I don't have any experience with the little ones, so I'm never as helpful in that department. Can rubrics be subject specific? That's a good question. The way I would answer that is the following. Let me just think for a second. They can. So the answer is yes, but I think the qualification I would make is when you're creating a rubric, you want to make sure that the rubric measures skills and not the product that they're producing. So in other words, if you create a rubric for like students are creating like a poster or something, right? What you don't want is to have a rubric that measures the poster. You want to have a rubric that measures the skills that are represented on the poster. So that's just slightly different things. But then on the other hand, you know, if you have a really good rubric for a presentation, like that could be used for a presentation in an English class, a presentation in a science class, a presentation in a social studies class. It could be used anywhere, right? If you have a really good writing rubric, that might be useful in other contexts as well. My good writing rubric could be used in, like, let's say a social studies class where they may also have writing assignments. They might need to be tweaked slightly, but there could certainly be overlap. Differentiated activities must be a whole group? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Differentiated students could be working on a project alone, and they still might have the opportunity to choose what they want to do or how they want to show their knowledge. Someone asked me to show an example of a single point rubric. Here it is. So basically what a single point rubric does is you have the category, you have the different criterias in the middle section. So this is the section where most of your students are going to land, right? But then you might have students that exceed the expectations in the middle category, or students that fall short. And so the reason why they're blank is because you don't want to tell students how they might exceed the standards. They can figure that out on their own, but this individualizes every student. So if they meet the criteria, you just circle the box. If they fall short, you give them individual feedback on how they fell short. If they exceeded the criteria, then you give them individual feedback on how successful they were and why they exceeded the standard, right? So you can see why this would be good for formative and not for summative. Because would you want to fill this out for a summative, assessment? I wouldn't. Okay, so that would answer that question, hopefully. Let me go back here. A lot of people are asking questions about getting the certificate for this session. I don't answer that question. Someone else will answer that question. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end it there. So I am finished. I want to thank everyone for attending this session. I got some nice feedback in the chat, which makes me feel good, so I really appreciate it. And I hope you all have a great evening. Take care.